In the embrace of a family bound by ancient oaths and hidden agendas, I found myself at a crossroads. Chapter 24. The silence provided throughout the car ride was like a cool blanket that engulfed my body and diminished the raging flames, bringing me back to a moderate state where I felt like I could finally breathe without my chest taking in the process. I don't know how long we spent in that silence as Xavier drove calmly, but eventually I felt like I had to speak a word and break the stillness. "Where are we going?" I croaked out, my voice coming out rough. I cleared my throat and turned from the window to face Xavier. He had one elbow resting on the arm, rest between our seats while he steered the wheel with his other hand. His facial expression was relaxed as he gazed down the road. "Anywhere you'd like." His response surprised me. I thought we were already headed somewhere. But according to his answer, he must have been driving around aimlessly. My heart fluttered, appreciating his way of trying to subdue my anger and hurt. No matter how small the act was, I don't know anywhere in this state. Xavier glanced over at me, reading my expression. "Do you like flowers?" I blinked, taken aback by his random question. Yeah, I do. Why?" He turned back to the road, a feint of a smile on his lips as he took a turn. "Would you like to take a stroll through the garden at our estate?" My face brightened at his words. "You have a garden?" Xavier nodded in response, not hiding his smile anymore as he noticed my excitement. "It's my favorite place at home. I would love to see it." I smiled appreciatively. "Then we shall go see it." Xavier grinned as he glanced at me once more. As I finally turned to gaze outside the window, I noticed that we'd strolled far away from town. We were surrounded by great trees that rose so high above the ground, they blocked the grass the sun rays from shining down on the road. "We appreciate our privacy. That's why we live a bit further away from town," Xavier explained. I wondered who he meant by that. "Who do you live with?" "My family." Now confused. "Your siblings? I didn't know you had any." He shook his head. "Not siblings. We're not blood related." Xavier glanced at me, and he must have caught on to my confused expression because he smiled slightly. "We are three leading families: the Conejos, the Tapajos, enthusiasm, and the cicateros. Our families have been well acquainted since this country's first discovery." My eyes widened. "I can't tell if you're exaggerating or not." Xavier chuckled out loud. "I'm not." My eyes widened further. If that were even possible. "Tell me more." I squeaked a bit too enthusiastically. Xavier's eyes widened in amusement as he glanced at me, and my cheeks instantly reddened. "That just sounds incredible. How is that even possible?" Instead of replying, Xavier slowed the car down, and when I glanced out the window, I was greeted by a wide golden gate that was gradually and gracefully opening automatically. My jaw involuntarily fell. I gaped at the extravagance of what only appeared to be the front entrance to the estate. The estate. It looked like a place out of a fairy tale. Too breathtaking and extravagant and elegant and everything beautiful. Xavier drove through the automatically opening gates, and we were once again surrounded by trees on both sides of the narrow road. Only this time they were neatly trimmed and in the brightest shade of green, looking so earthy and alive. My voice had gotten stuck in my throat as I gazed at the beauty of the estate while Xavier drove slowly, clearly giving me time to take in every detail, though there were too many to take in at once. Another turn and we slowly arrived at a large glowing fountain station directly at the front of the 4-story building, and he circled around the flowing fountain to park directly in front of the house. I gasped as I turned to stare at him wide-eyed. "You live here?" Xavier smiled and offered a single nod. "Do you like it?" I nearly scoffed. "Is that a serious question?" He chuckled in response, unbuckling his seat belt. "Let me take you on a quick tour of the insides." I nodded eagerly, unbuckling my own seat belt and hopping out of the car. The large front doors were already spread wide open, and Xavier appeared on my left side and motioned towards the long marble stairway leading to the door. When we entered, the first thing to hit me was the warm, welcoming aroma that wafted through the air. It smelled like fresh roses. Ahead of the double doors was a grand double stairway into the upper floors, and above her head dangled a dazzling crystal chandelier. "This is beyond beautiful," I whispered, my eyes roaming around the place. "You have such a breathtaking house. I'm glad you like it. It's been a part of our family for ages. Speaking of, I remembered the conversation we were having in the car. Tell me more about your family," I asked hopefully. His eyes were shining as he stared down at me, a small smile gracing his lips. "I'd love to." He motioned towards the stairway. "Let me lead you toward the gardens first." I walked beside Xavier as we passed below the grand stairway to the back of the house, where a large glass door was also spread wide open, welcoming us outside to the huge garden. From our place, it looked like the garden spread out for miles beyond the house. On each side of the narrow walkway were thousands of flowers blossoming in every color. I couldn't help but instantly smile at the sight of them. "This is so gorgeous," I exclaimed, inhaling sharply and feeling my chest flutter as the wonderful floral scent hit my senses. I glanced at Xavier to see him staring at me, a small smile on his lips. Although I had caught him staring, he still didn't look away. His striking gaze shimmered with an indescribable emotion as he continued to stare at me. My heart began to race, and I felt the wings of 1,000 butterflies flutter in my stomach. I forced my eyes to move away, the blood running to my cheeks and warming up my face. Xavier straightened his shoulders and cleared his throat, walking slowly beside me and leading me further into the garden. "Our families are native to this state, and have been well acquainted since the early discovery of this country." My eyes fell back on him as he began to speak, repeating the words of earlier. "Even as things began growing out of control, our families remained close in touch and made an oath that no matter whose hands this state falls into, we will remain as its protectors, that we will be its shield, forever defend it and fight against whatever dangers threaten to disrupt its peace." And because of that oath, our family never broke apart. Generation after the other grew up learning about the history of our family and the oaths of our great-great-grandfathers, and the importance of holding on to the promises we made for the safety of our home. I stared at Xavier in complete awe of what he had just narrated. He glanced at me to check for my reaction, and I saw a glint of amusement in his eyes. "But how do you protect it?" "To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Noble. Heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm." "I mean, isn't that job already taken care of by the forces?" He shifted his gaze to where his footsteps were falling as he thought over my question. Then he inhaled deeply. "The harsh truth is that those forces don't possess the power to aid to everything every time. That's why we interfere." Xavier glanced down at my reaction, and I tried to maintain a normal, blank expression as a way to encourage him to go on. I was far too interested in his story that I couldn't bear the thought of him stopping the narration just as it was getting more interesting. "We take care of all the businesses that the higher officials are unaware of. In simpler words, we work from the streets." My heart fell to my stomach as I pondered over the vagueness of his answer, and although I wasn't entirely sure I was ready to know the answer, I couldn't help but ask, "What kind of businesses?" A feint of a smile graced his lips, and he gazed into the distance. "All sorts." My mouth was getting drier by the minute. "Xavier," I slowed down in my tracks, and when he noticed my movement he reciprocated my action, turning around to study me with a worried expression. "I can't do this without knowing the whole truth." Xavier hesitated in his response, his jaw ticking as he got lost in his thoughts. "And I don't want to hide anything from you, Nora. I want you to know the whole truth, everything about who and what I am." I bit the inside of my cheek, staring into his unwavering gaze, filled with promises I wasn't entirely sure he could keep. "Those men that are causing us all this trouble," Xavier began to explain. "The rivalry is the result of our interference with their so-called business of shipping illegal substances into the state." My eyes widened as his words registered in my brain. An indescribable fear nestled into my chest and wrapping itself around my heart. My blood ran cold as I began piecing everything together. "You're involved with the mafia," I managed to whisper, my eyes searching his frantically. begging for him to deny it and tell me I am not once again exactly where I used to be. But all that Xavier could offer was a long silence, a type of silence that tore through my chest and ate to the core. If by involved, you mean dealing with them, then no, I am not. I took a sharp intake of breath, relieved but not entirely, because I was sure there was more to it. But my family has never, and will never, allow the disruption of peace within our home. No matter what the dangers, we will always interfere to halt their shipments of whatever illegal and destructive substances and weaponry they try to sneak into our state. Xavier paused for a minute, then slowly took a step forward, inching closer to me and stopping a mere foot away. My heart began to race as I craned my neck to see him better, his eyes shining down on me with such determination. I was in complete awe. It's important that you know, Nora, that no matter what I can't, I will not ever stop fighting for my home. My throat restricted, but I managed to croak out, "Of course you have the right to fight for whatever you believe in." He nodded slowly. "But I need you to know that if you choose to stay, this is how it will always be. My family will always come first, and together we will always fight for our home." My throat had gone dry, and I couldn't think of a response, partially because his words were too powerful and true that I had no further comment to offer, and partially because he was standing at such a close proximity. His warm breaths as he confidently spoke those words were mixing with my own ragged ones. "And I also need you to know." Xavier inched closer, his nose now almost touching mine, "that if you do choose to stay," his striking silver gaze found mine, and he stared me down with such an intensity that my breath hitched in my throat, "you will also become my family. You will always come first. And for that, I will need you to lead beside me in the protection of our home." Chapter 25. Xavier's words continued to ring in my ears, echoing all the way down to my stomach and bursting into a beast that clawed at my insides. I couldn't believe the words he had just spoken. He had told me that if I simply chose to stay, I would become his family, and that I will have to lead beside him. He was completely out his mind to believe I possessed the power to lead in whatever business he was involved with. I could barely lead my own life, let alone serve the protection of an entire state. Subconsciously, I began to state all the reasons why I was a no, fit for the position, as badly as I wanted to stay by Xavier's side and never leave, as badly as I wanted to become his family. I knew deep down that I was not worthwhile. I couldn't help him protect his home. I could barely protect my own friends, could barely protect myself. I pulled myself away from where I stood, stepping further and further until I was at least 4 feet away from Xavier. He straightened his back, frowning as he studied my expression. I began shaking my head frantically, my hair bouncing off my shoulders. "I can't do that, Xavier," I whispered, a huge lump forming in my throat. "I can't lead beside you. It's not in my power. I don't understand any of that." I let out a dark chuckle. I could barely protect myself. My eyes met his silver gaze, studying me patiently as I continued to ramble on. "I'm no fit for that position." Xavier took a step forward as he reached out for me, but instantly, my hand came up to hold him in his tracks, asking him to stay put. "No." His confused gaze met mine, and it broke my heart to watch the sliver of pain flies at my rejection. "I don't understand what's going on, why I feel the way I do whenever you're around me. We have barely had enough chance to get to know each other, but it's like you have this unexplainable influence on me and my emotions. I feel imprisoned in your presence." The growing lump in my throat was beginning to restrict my ability to speak, and so I shut my mouth, feeling my chest ache. "I understand," Xavier began to speak lowly, but I shook my head. "No, you don't." "Yes, I do," he insisted, reaching out for me once again. Before I had the chance to pull back, my hand was already captured in his. A bundle of sparks shot up my arm, leaving a tingling sensation where his skin connected with mine. His eyes moved down to where our hands entwined, and he raised both our hands up to our eye level. "You feel that?" My eyes widened at his words. "I feel it." I couldn't help it as my eyes began to water. both as the result of everything that had gone down that day and also for the relief that he reciprocated my feelings. I couldn't believe he felt it. You are right, Nora. It is unexplainable. Although we have barely had the chance to properly know one another, you have a power over me that I never imagined another mortal to possess. Only I don't mind feeling imprisoned by your presence, because I accept the fact that I am completely at your mercy. I couldn't help the gasp that escaped my lips. Only it came out so distorted it sounded like a sob. My emotions were in a whirlwind. I didn't know it was humanly possible to feel so deeply as I was at that moment. The only explanation that I can offer is that we are soulmates. Nora, we complete one another, Xavier whispered, his other hand coming up and his finger brushing gently against my cheek. I was surprised to find that he believed in soulmates. I hadn't met a guy who ever did. I realize I might have said a bit too much for one day. That it might have scared you away. Maybe I should have left the last part for another time. He gave me a small smile, his eyes twinkling. I couldn't help but smile too. It would have still scared me off. I admitted. It's nothing like you imagine. I would never ask you to fight for a deal with anything beyond your comfort. I only need you by my side. He whispered the last part, his fingers gently grabbing my chin and lifting my head up so I could meet his eyes. Stay. I knew that no matter what I tell myself, no matter how many times I repeat that this is a horrible idea, that I'm no fit for a man like Xavier, I will never be able to leave his side. Because just as he confessed how I possess a hold over him, I knew damn well that he had a strong one over me too. So I nodded. Xavier's silver eyes brightened up, shimmering down with a great sense of happiness. Slowly, he leaned forward, and once again my breath hitched in my throat. His chin lifted up, and very gently he pressed a light kiss to my forehead, and my heart nearly leapt out of my chest. Should we go back inside? He eventually asked. I nodded, finally noticing that the sun was beginning to set. The sky had turned a darker shade of orange, with the clouds appearing as long, purple brush strokes. Xavier turned us around to face the house, and with my hand still held gently in his, began leading me towards the glass doors. Is no one home? I wondered. He has mentioned that he lived with 3 families, but I had yet to see anyone in the house. Xavier nodded. They are. We just respect each other's privacy when we have company over. It seems like you all get along so well. Xavier chuckled. We had better, or else living would be a total nightmare. Just as he had completed the sentence, we walked into the house to be greeted by Vincent. For a second, I was surprised to see him since I had completely forgotten about his connection to Xavier. Elliot's words from the lake began to ring in my ears, where he described Vincent as the right hand to the biggest mob in all of North America. My heartbeat began to accelerate. Was Xavier aware of that? Nora, and we meet again, Vincent exclaimed as he neared me, his arms wide open in greeting. I didn't know if he was asking for a hug, but he would be beyond foolish to think I'd give him one. I took a small, unappeasable step backwards, and cringed a smile. Hi, Vincent. He stopped a feet away, a huge grin on his face, and his arms slowly fell to his sides. Glancing at Xavier, he raised a brow. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nilben, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. I guess you let her in on our family history. I frowned at the nickname, glancing at Xavier to see him bearing a tight smile. I told her what she needs to know. The underlying meaning didn't go unnoticed by me. What she needs to know. That could only mean that there was more that he deemed me unready to know of. Very well, Vincent chuckled. Welcome to the family, Nora. His eyes shimmered in joy, and I was taken aback by how similar his silver gaze was to that of Xavier's. However, although they were at the exact shade and brightness, Xavier's gaze still held an unrecognizable feel to it that Vincent's lacked. Thanks, I mumbled. Xavier must have sensed how out of place I felt, because he immediately came to the rescue. I felt him set his warm hand on my lower back, pulling me closer in. When my eyes met his, he smiled down at me and spoke. Vincent is my brother, the head of the Tapaha family and my right-hand man. My breath hitched in my throat. Why your right-hand man? I'd hoped I heard him wrong. Xavier's eyebrows furrowed at my nervous tone, and he searched in my eyes confused. Suddenly, Vincent chuckled loudly, interrupting our gazing. We looked over at him to see him shaking his head. She must have heard of my false reputation, he answered to Xavier, and his eyes lit. That reply was enough to clear up all of his confusion. You've heard of Vincent before? Xavier asked me, and I didn't know how to answer that question. I looked between the two of them, the back of my neck heating up from the nervousness. Vincent chuckled once more. You don't have to be afraid of me, Nora. We're family now. His determined eyes held a strong promise that somehow erased my doubts and fears. So slowly, I nodded. His false reputation was established by the lower mobs whom he interfered with the businesses of. Xavier began to explain. They couldn't make sense of our need to protect our state when we weren't federal agents, and hence, idiotically, came to the conclusion that we are another mafia who had already claimed this territory for our business. And that's the reason we were intervening in and destroying their shipments. I took a minute to fully comprehend his words. But we have no connection to the mafia whatsoever, Vincent clarified. I nodded, reluctantly. Maybe they were speaking the truth, but I could never be entirely sure by just hearing their side of the story. Elliot claimed that his most trusted friend had informed him Vincent was the right hand of the largest mafia in North America. Who knew who was telling the truth now? Suddenly, a petite frame with a black pixie cut descended the staircase and walked up to us. She appeared a bit shorter than me, maybe reaching 5'2". She wore casual dark blue jeans with a plain black tank top and a pair of black Vans. She stopped right next to Vincent, and her wide jade eyes fell on me. They suddenly shrunk into two crescents as she gave me a wide smile high. Her high-pitched, yet low voice spoke. I was so taken aback by her adorableness, I took a few seconds too long to finally reply. Hey. I was even more surprised to find Vincent circling around her waist and gently pulling her petite form to his body. Her head rested on his upper chest and her hand found his resting on her hip and she grasped onto it lovingly. Well, that I certainly did not expect. Nora, this is Scarlett, Vincent's girlfriend. Xavier introduced us. I nodded and offered her a smile, and she reciprocated the action. It's so nice to meet you. You too, Scarlett. If you don't mind me asking. I cleared my throat, knowing damn well the question was bound to sound rude. But I had to ask. How long have you guys been together for? Vincent's eyes fell on me, and he gave me a shameful smile. His hand came up to scratch the back of his neck, as if he caught on to the reason behind my question. We just recently met. Around a week ago. My eyes widened, surprised by his response. They met only a week ago and were already appearing to be so in love, but I knew I didn't have the right to judge anyone else's relationship, so I nodded instead, smiling widely and complimenting how well they appear next to each other. Xavier then excused us to give me a quick tour of the house. As we walked away, he leaned down to whisper his question in my ear. Why were you so interested in how long they'd been dating? I bit the inside of my cheek, stopping at the bottom of the staircase and turning to him. Xavier's eyes wide and in understanding. Or did she have feelings for him? I'm not sure, but Vincent did seem interested in her back at the inn, and I guess that led her on to believe that their relationship had potential. I just wanted to make sure he wasn't playing any games on her while dating another. Xavier shook his head. Vincent would never do that. He truly was interested in your friend. But that was before he met his mate. Mate, as in soulmate. And he nodded. There he goes again with that word. Do you honestly believe that they exist? Before replying to my question, he motioned towards the staircase, and I moved to begin ascending with him following on my right. The concept of soulmates is another one of our family's strong beliefs. And how do you know you've met your real soulmate? I questioned. Xavier took a sharp intake of breath, pondering over his words before he spoke them. To put it in simple words, it's when you meet someone and instantly feel like your whole world has shifted. Everything about them engulfs your senses, and you begin to feel so deeply when you're around them like you've never done before. My eyes moved to his, and my breath hitched in my throat. He was describing exactly how I felt when I first met him, and exactly how I felt at that moment, pausing in the middle of the staircase and staring into his powerful silver gaze. Could it be possible? Could Xavier really be my soulmate? Our interlocked gaze was suddenly broken as a voice interrupted us. We glanced a few steps down and found a middle-aged woman standing at the bottom of the staircase, a familiar bag in her hand. She stretched out her arm and offered it to us. I apologize for the interruption, but you left your belongings in the car and I didn't know where to keep them. Her soft voice spoke with so much respect, her gaze staring at Xavier's chest instead of into his eyes. He stepped away from me and descended the few steps to reach her. It's all right, Mrs. Smith. Thank you. He grabbed my shopping bag from earlier and turned to walk up to me. But while doing so, he separated the bag and sneaked a glance inside. His movement slowed down as he walked up to me, a confused frown growing on his features. Mrs. Smith had stalked off towards the other side of the house, and we were once again alone on the stairs. Are you okay? I asked him, confused as to what could have caused the sudden shift in his mood. Xavier raised his head and his eyes met mine again, and he gave a stiff nod. He offered me the bag. Yours, I believe. I nodded and grabbed the bag, thanking him. I turned to continue heading up the stairs when his voice halted me in my tracks. What do you need those kills for? My nerves suddenly went into hyperdrive and my heartbeat began to increase at the mention of what I'd forgotten was in there. Without turning around, I replied to his question. They're just vitamins. His steps began to move up the stairs, coming closer to me. He stopped next to me, his doubtful eyes finding mine, and he leaned down until we were at eye level. Then why is your heart beating so fast? I was taken aback, my eyes widening. Was he serious? Xavier's eyes held mine as he defiantly searched between them for answers. I told you my story, Nora, his breath and my face with his close proximity, and I gulped my nerves away. It's time you tell me yours. Chapter 26. For some indescribable reason, I felt angered by Xavier's words. I don't have a story to tell. I turned abruptly and began to walk down the hallway, not sure where I was headed to, but I had had enough of standing in the middle of the staircase and pausing after every step. On the floor of the narrow hallway lay a long grey carpet that stretched all the way down the hall, and the walls were a light shade of beige and covered in almost every inch with various sized frames containing family photos, some in black and white, and some tracing back to what looked like centuries-old original drawn portraits. Nora, Xavier called out for me, and I forced my feet to stop and plant me to the ground. I turned around to meet his gaze, and he stopped a foot away from me. I thought you said we couldn't build a relationship without knowing the whole truth. I did say that, and I bit my tongue for having done so. The ugly truth was that I couldn't ask Xavier to tell me everything for keeping my own in the dark. If he trusted me enough to tell me his family's secrets, then I must have the courage to let him in on my past as well. But I couldn't bring myself to do that. I did say that if there were any significant truths you needed to know, I would tell you them in every detail. But there's nothing worth knowing. I clenched my fist so tightly by my side. My nails dug deeply into my palm. We both know that's not true. Xavier's jaw clenched tightly, and I watched the muscle tick on the side of his face. Why are you lying to me? My chest ached as I identified the pain in the tone of his voice, and I hated myself for being the cause of it. My eyes began to sting as I bit the inside of my cheek. I know I began to deny it, but he cut me off sharply. What is it with the whole history repeating itself? My heart took a sudden leap out of my chest, and it began to beat rapidly against my rib cage that I felt it would break free at any second. What do you mean? I whispered, feigning ignorance. Xavier sighed frustratingly, his jaw once again ticking in annoyance. I've heard your fights with Elliot. Nora, don't take me for a fool. My eyes began to burn more intensely as I fought against the tears. Knowing I no longer had a way out, Xavier noticed, and his eyes softened a bit. He stepped closer to me until my nose was almost touching his chest. Gently, his index finger traced down to under my chin, and he tipped my head back so I could look up into his striking, determined, and promise-filled gaze. You can trust me enough to reveal your past to me. My heart clenched in my chest, my mind going over everything he had done for me and my friends so far. The one thing he was asking for in return, I was struggling to provide. But he deserved the truth. At least that much I owed to him after the lengths he had gone to protect my friends and I. So hesitantly, I nodded my head. Xavier's eyes brightened gradually, and he took a step back, turning towards the other side of the hallway. He motioned with his hand for me to head that way. We walked slowly as I felt my stomach clenching, my nervousness increasing, the nausea and leaving my mouth dry. At the end of the hallway, we arrived at a wide double door. Xavier stepped forward and reached into his back pocket, retrieving a golden key into the lock. He turned it and we heard a light click as the door was unlocked and he pushed it open, gesturing for me to enter first. The insides of the room took my breath away, as every other part of the house had. It was an office, only so dreamy, with 3 walls entirely covered in bookshelves stretching from the wooden floors up to the high ceilings, filled with hundreds of books. Directly across from the door was a wide mahogany desk packed with papers and a laptop, and behind it the fourth wall of the room was a huge glass window that spread across the entire wall, and gave a marvelous view of the garden below. Wow, I whispered in wonder. Every place in this house was breathtaking. I heard the click of the door closing behind me, and I turned to glance at Xavier. He gave me a small smile and motioned towards the right side of the huge office, where there was a seating area with comfortable-looking couches. We walked up to the area and sat down, Xavier to my right. I dropped the bag I had in my hand to the floor beside me, and got comfortable on the seat, shifting my body so I was mostly facing Xavier as we sat side by side. His eyes stared into mine expectantly, and my breath got stuck in my throat. I didn't know where to begin. Xavier sensed my unease, what with my leg bouncing and my hands shaking and my palms sweating. He reached out and grabbed both my hands into his, pulling me forwards and resting our entwined hands on his lap. He drew circles with his thumb on the back of my wrists, his eyes never leaving mine. That small gesture was enough to again send to a whirlwind. I felt my eyes watering, and I tried to yank my hands out of his grasp, but he held on to them tightly. He shook his head. You don't have to hold back. I bit the inside of my cheeks so hard I began to draw blood. I could identify the metallic taste, and it only increased my nausea. How did you meet your current friends? Xavier suddenly asked. I was taken aback by his question, so it took me a few seconds too long to put together an answer. We met in college. I was already friends with Ariel since high school, and then we met the rest at college. Xavier nodded, a small smile on his lips. Were they friends then, or did you meet everyone separately? I shook my head. The guys were all friends, and they were living in the same apartment. We met at a frat party. I began to recall the first night we met, a ghost of a smile on my lips. Ariel had gotten so drunk that night. I chuckled. After dancing manically, she ran into Seth and accidentally spilled her drink on the both of them. And Seth, being the kind-hearted gentleman that he is, made it his mission to make sure she cleaned up properly and sobered up a little, since the house was packed and she was sure to fall prey to at least one guy, even though I told him I could take care of her. The next day, we ran into Seth again, and he was with Noah and Ayat. After that night we started hanging out, and it wasn't a week later that I met Bella in one of my photography classes. And, of course, when I introduced her to the rest, she fell head over heels for Elliot. It was like love at first sight. I chuckled, my heart fluttering as I remembered what was one of the best times of my life. It didn't take long before we all became really close friends, hanging out on every weekend, spending every consecutive holiday together, I glanced at Xavier to see him gazing down at me with an unrecognizable emotion in his eyes, and a ghost of a smile on his lips. On my second year of college, I made a new friend. My heart suddenly clenched tightly in my chest, and I felt my palms begin to get clammy in Xavier's hands. And I don't know if he noticed or not, but he continued holding on to them while watching me expectantly, urging me to go on. Elliot wasn't too keen on our friendship, saying he had heard the guy was bad news. I felt Xavier tense, his back straightening a bit, yet still, he held on to my hands and continued the circular motion of his thumbs on the back of my wrist. But he was very charming, and I was very naive. I bit the inside of my cheek as my voice broke. So many girls had a crush on him, and of course, like the young dumb girl that I was, I'd felt very special when he picked me out of the mass. We hadn't been friends for too long before he asked me out, and I was so blinded by his charming behavior that I immediately said yes. I recalled the memory of the day he took me ice skating, our first date, and I was smiling, giggling at every word he said, because I was so bewitched by his eyes, cold blue eyes. Everything was going so well. He was the first boyfriend I had ever had, and he was a real gentleman, spoiling me every week with luxurious gifts, taking me out on a date every weekend, holding my hand and offering his jacket whenever it got too cold. My eyes fell down to as Xavier held my hands, no longer able to look into his eyes as I recalled the worst memory of my past. But then he started hiding things from me, and lying about his whereabouts. So, one night, I decided to discreetly follow him after he left my dorm. He led us to a nightclub, but circled around to the back door, where he met with a group of men who looked much older than his age, much bigger, and much more dangerous looking. They exchanged words, and I turned to leave before I get caught. I recall that chilly night when I ran back to my dorm, to find Ariel already asleep in her bed, and I was left alone to ponder over what I'd seen. I decided the next day that I'd confront him about it, and ask him why he'd been lying to me when we had been dating for over 5 months. I shook my head, remembering just how foolish I'd been. He didn't appreciate me getting all up in his business. I felt a huge lump forming in my throat, and I tried to swallow it down. He found out that I followed him that night, and thinking that I'd caught on to what he was dealing, he completely lost it. I felt my lips start to quiver, reliving the parts I had fought so hard to forget. He ordered me to stay away from my friends, for the fear that I'd tell on him. He threatened that he would do worse to them than what he did to me, and I believed him. I believed he would. That night, I saw a side of him that I had never before seen in anyone, and I knew that if he could do something like that to someone he supposedly loved, the words felt like acid in my mouth, then he would definitely do worse to a bunch of others that he couldn't even tolerate. Xavier's grip on my hands had tightened slightly, his gaze never leaving my face, and my eyes never meeting his. I disconnected with my friends for weeks, during which he never stopped emotionally tormenting me for breaking his trust. I heard a deep growl rumble in Xavier's chest, and his grasp tightened even further on my hands, but not yet to the point where it was uncomfortable. When Ariel's persistent to get answers didn't stop, I decided to secretly meet up with her after class, just to tell her that I needed some time to figure things out, at least until dawn. I bit hard on my bottom lip, until he cools off and I could regain his trust. But he had people watching me, and what got to him that I'd met up with my friend. I took a quick glance at Xavier, seeing his eyes now fixed on the wall behind me, a shade darker than the usual. His teeth were gritted so tightly that I could see the muscles in his jaw clenching. No matter how many times I swore to him that I hadn't told Ariel anything to give him away, he wouldn't believe me. I felt my chest tightening further with every word, and my tears began to flow freely now. I couldn't control myself as my voice broke. That was the worst night of my life. He had hurt me so bad to the point where I'd gone completely numb. Xavier suddenly released my hands, his own falling to his lap and clenching so hard his knuckles turned completely white. I forcefully continued to the end, knowing that I would never be able to bring this topic back up again. So I had to tell him everything now while I still could. I only vaguely remember waking up in the hospital the next time my eyes opened. I tried to recall the memories when I came back to consciousness. I was out for 3 days. And when I woke up, Ariel told me that Elliot had followed me to his apartment, where he found me unconscious on the floor, with him nowhere to be found. My breathing was coming out rapidly, and I was beginning to see black spots invade my vision. Even with the statement that we made in the word out for his arrest, they never caught him, because he had men of power protecting his back. I croaked out the fact that I hated the most. I couldn't stand looking at Xavier now that he was informed of my most vulnerable state. My tears kept flowing until my vision had gone blurry, and I tried to restrain the sobs that threatened to escape. Through hazy vision, I saw a hand reach out and grab my hand, the familiar spark shooting up my arms. Xavier's fingers grabbed my chin and slowly lifted my head so our eyes could meet. I blinked the tears away, trying to restrain the rest threatening to fall. His eyes were not the usual striking, silver. They were now steel, hardened emotionals. Through clenched teeth, he growled out, "What's his name?" I took a sharp intake of breath, surprised by his only response to everything I had just narrated. I shook my head. I made an oath to never mention his name out loud. "Tell me his name," Xavier insisted, his voice hard and icy. I shook my head no. "There's no point. Tell me his name." "Nora." "No." But he didn't even flinch. My tears began to stream down my face once more. Now completely reckless, I began to sob. "There's no point," I nearly yelled. He suddenly yanked me by my hands, and I fell forward into his chest. His arms came around me, wrapping tightly and stroking the back of my head. But it was suffocating me. Being in his presence was suffocating me. Being held was suffocating me. I planted my hands flat against Xavier's chest and tried to push, but he wouldn't let go, and I started to hyperventilate. My breaths came out rapidly, and with tightened fists I began to punch against Xavier's chest. He suddenly let me go, pulling back but still holding onto my shoulders tightly. His eyes found mine, widened with fear. He began to speak, but I couldn't hear him. The only things I could hear were my ragged breathing, and my beating heart beating so fast I felt like it would burst out of my chest at any second. I felt like it would stop beating altogether. Xavier shook my shoulders gently, but now I couldn't even see him. My vision started going hazy, with dark spots invading my sight, until eventually it turned completely black and I felt myself falling forward into strong arms. Chapter 27. Gradually, I started coming back to my senses. The echo of the birds chirping became nearer and the touch of soft silk crawling over my skin became clearer. I forced my heavy eyelids open to find myself blinded by a ray of sunlight falling directly on where I lay. I blinked repeatedly until my vision adjusted to the room, and my gaze took in my surrounding. It was a large, grandeur bedroom and I was seated in the center of it, lied on a king-sized bed with grey silk bed, sheets that were unbelievably soft against my skin. It took a few minutes too long to recall the last events that went down before my sleep. I didn't know how long ago that was, because I had no idea what time of day it was at that moment. Abruptly, I sat upright in bed, the sheets falling off my torso. I backed against the headboard and immediately grabbed my pounding head. I was familiar with that pain. I must have slept for way too long. My gaze shifted to my right where I searched the nightstand for a clock, but found it bearing none. There was only a single lamp that was switched on even though the sunlight provided more than enough brightness to the room. My eyes moved down to my body to find that I was still in last night's attire. They allowed me to sleep in jeans. No wonder I was so uncomfortable. I'd wished someone would have woken me just so I changed into a more comfortable attire then gone back to sleep. I would have enjoyed being wrapped by those silk sheets much better. I shifted my weight to the side of the bed, where I had to literally roll to reach the end because of how big the mattress was, and I dropped my legs to the cold tiled floor. When my skin adjusted to the cool surface, I pushed my body to stand straight and instantly grabbed the headboard for balance. My vision turned black for a sec and then returned to normal. That's when my stomach gave a deep rumble. I was so starved to the point where I was craving the taste of literally anything and everything. But within the next few seconds, the haze that was clouding over my mind, blocking the memories of last night, began to fade away, and the events started to become clearer. I started to remember the story I narrated to Xavier word by word, and a strong sense of shame and embarrassment nestled deep in my chest. I could feel my face begin to heat up, and my face panned so hard I heard the slap echo in the quiet of the room. Why, that was the only question running through my mind. Why the hell did I tell him all of that? Why didn't I lie? Why didn't I come up with a story that wouldn't have ruined my image the way I know it is ruined now? My hands were beginning to tremble with the shame I felt, and I couldn't bear the thought of running into Xavier ever again, of looking him in the eyes when I knew he was fully aware of my past stupidity and vulnerability. I searched the room to check whether my purse had been brought up here, but I couldn't find it anywhere. Groaning, I began to walk towards the open door leading to the bathroom, where I splashed my face with ice, cold water, and brushed my teeth with the spare toothbrush I found in the cabinet behind the mirror. I dried off my face, then fixed my messy hair into a tight bun. After a few minutes spent focusing on my breathing and gathering up the courage, I decided to walk out of the bedroom. I was in the same hall from earlier, directly across the wall covered in family portraits. The amount of characters within the pictures was unbelievable, and I had to fight against my curiosity and force my feet to continue moving towards the staircase instead of examining the portrait. I began to slowly tiptoe towards the staircase, my senses on high alert in case someone suddenly steps out of any of the bedrooms. I distinctly remember Xavier informing me that 3 families are staying in this house. I reached the staircase within seconds, but the instant my hand hit the railing, I heard the creak of a door opening by the end of the hallway and the deep voices of at least 3 men discussing a matter among themselves. A sudden rush of adrenaline coursed through my veins, and a voice in my head yelled at me to flight. Letting go of my grip on the railing, I flew down the stairs, skipping to sometimes 3 steps at a time. However, in the process of running, the sound of my feet coming down hard on the steps got louder than before and echoed through the house, and the murmurs of earlier slowly came to a stop. I didn't spare a second to glance behind as I kept running down the long staircase, reaching the end and frantically searching the front room for my purse. I needed my purse if I wanted to get out of here. It carried my phone, which I needed to call a cab, and also my money, which I needed to pay the cab driver with. I rushed from room to room, entering the kitchen to and walking straight into the housekeeper from earlier as she carried a pile of napkins in her hands. She almost dropped them to the floor, and I murmured quick apologies. Purse. Did you see my purse? I didn't know why, but I was yelling at her as her brown eyes widened in fear. She shook her head repeatedly. No, ma'am. I did not see your purse. I groaned loudly, my heartbeat now racing as I began to panic. I had to get out of here before I ran into anyone else. I needed to go home. I needed my friends. Your purse is in the living room. Ma'am. A soft voice spoke from behind the counter. It was a younger girl dressed in the same house, keeping attire, who had informed me of that. I nodded my head, repeatedly thanking her as I left through the kitchen door, not knowing where exactly the living room was, but going on a search anyway. After walking into 3 different seating areas and finding each to be bigger than the last, I finally found which living room the housekeeper was talking about when I spotted my black purse on a coffee table right next to an L-shaped couch. I rushed over to it and grabbed the bag, zipping it open and fishing for my phone. With trembling hands I began to dial the number to call a cab, simultaneously turning to head towards the front door. But the second I turned away, I slammed violently into what felt like a wall, losing my balance and dropping the phone. I heard it clatter to the ground, and I cringed at the sound, knowing for sure my phone screen wouldn't have come out alive from the strong impact. A pair of hands grabbed my upper arms and steadied me, and I instantly backed away from the familiar touch. My eyes fell down to where my phone lay, face down on the floor. Everything all right? Xavier questioned. I bit the inside of my cheek, last night's memories still fresh in my mind. You broke my phone, I accused, his head lowered to where my eyes lay, and he cleared his throat. I apologize. I will replace it with a newer one. My neck heated up. I don't want you to do that. Xavier went silent for a second before speaking up. But I must make up for my mistake. I shook my head, stepping aside to pass him by. I want to go home. I started towards the open doorway leading out of the living room, searching for the front door, and I could hear Xavier's footsteps following me behind. Nora, I don't think that's a good idea. I want to see my friends. I cut him off. He reached out for my arm once more, his hand coming to wrap around my wrist and stop me from moving further away. I turned around and yanked my arm out of his grip, stumbling a step back. Stop touching me, I blurted out. Xavier's arm dropped down to his side, and he continued to stare at me. I was breathing heavily by that point, my eyes burning holes in his chest. He took a step closer, and I mocked his by taking one back. When he noticed my movement, he stopped his, planting his feet to the ground a few steps away from me. I was still staring at his chest. You don't have to do this, Nora, he informed me in a gentle voice, taking a step forward. I tried to move my own legs, but they wouldn't budge. His arm stretched forward and his hand gently grasped my chin, tilting my head upwards. Look at me, he demanded. But I refused to. I couldn't bear the look in his eyes, no matter what it was, though my eyes remained fixed on his chest. Xavier moved another step forward, his hand moving from my chin to cut the side of my face, and his other hand coming up to repeat the action on the other side of my face. He softly tilted my head back again. Nora, please look at me. The gentleness of his tone almost broke me down, but I bit hard on my tongue, almost drawing blood. I could sense him coming closer to me as his head lowered down, his warm minty breath fanning over my face. In a gentle motion, his soft lips crashed against my forehead, and he held still for what felt like an eternity with my breath hitched in my throat. A spark of sensations traveled from his lips connected with my skin down to my cheeks where they warmed up. Slowly, Xavier pulled away from my face, but his hands remained in their positions. I blinked away the shock and slowly moved my eyes up to meet his gaze. His shimmering silver eyes were staring down at me with a deep emotion that clenched the muscles in my chest. They brightened up as our gazes met, and I saw the glimmer of joy sparkling in them. It's all right, he whispered reassuringly. Those two words alone caused my eyes to well up with tears, and I swallowed the lump growing in my throat. I forced my feet to take a step away to back up from his touch, blinking the tears away as I cleared my throat. See, can we just forget about last night? I asked hopefully. Xavier pursed his lips, looking like he's about to argue. Please. The muscle in his jaw ticked as he clenched his teeth, before forcefully nodding his head once. I sighed in relief, thanking him. I still want to go back. I want to see my friends. Xavier nodded, his eyes moving from mine to the button of his dress, shirt sleeve as he fixed his attire. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nilban, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. I will take you to them. He motioned towards the front door, offering a tight smile. We were driving down an unfamiliar path, not far away from where Xavier's family estate lay. It took only a few minutes to reach the small cabin surrounded by tall, enormous trees, and I wasn't sure we even left the premises of his estate. The car slowed down as it got closer to the modern cabin. Why are we stopping? I glanced at Xavier in confusion, to find his eyes still fixed on the cabin. Because we've arrived. My frown deepened. I thought you were taking me to my friends. My tone was accusatory, and it came out harsher than I expected, because I was tired and I needed my best friend. Xavier quickly glanced at me, and cleared his throat. They're here. The second those words came out through his lips, the front doors of the cabin were burst open and two figures came walking out. Their postures stiffened in high alert. As they descended the porch steps and neared us, I began to see them more clearly. Noah, I whispered in disbelief, my hand already on the door handle pushing the car door open. Elliot and Noah stopped a few feet away from the car. Noah's fist tightened on a baseball bat. What the hell is going on? I rushed out of the car and ran towards them, stopping a foot away and my hands immediately falling on Noah's shoulders as I began bombarding him with questions. What's going on? Why are you guys here? And why are you holding that bat? He dropped the bat in his hand with a soft thud. His hands went over my own and he grabbed them gently. Everything's all right. Don't worry, he reassured. Let's get inside first, then we'll explain. He motioned to the cabin and dragged me towards it. Nora. Wait. Elliot stopped us, and we all turned to look at him. He glanced at Noah and Xavier. We'll be right behind you. They understood that he was implying he wanted to speak to me privately, so they nodded and continued towards the cabin, Noah picking up his bat along the way. I walked towards Elliot. Hey, UHM. I'm really sorry for pushing your buttons the way I did. I was freaking out and it's all right. No, it's not. I shouldn't have treated you that way. I shook my head. I understand that you were stressed out about everything. So it's all right. Elliot sighed, his hand coming up to brush his black hair back frustratingly. We're all stressed out. I had no right to say those things to you. My heart clenched as I detected the sincerity in his voice. I forgive you. I voiced the words I knew he needed to hear and I meant them. I understood how freaked out he was, and people often be about random things when they're in that state. Elliot broke out a cheeky grin, his arms stretching wide, and a single eyebrow rising in question. I chuckled as I moved forward into his embrace, wrapping my arms around his torso and giving a crushing squeeze, to which he groaned painfully in response to. He backed away then and chuckled. To let go inside. I nodded and followed him towards the porch. Chapter 28. As I walked through the open door, the first thing my eyes lay upon were the figures seated tensely on the couches by the lit fireplace. They instantly got up to their feet. Ariel and Bella rushed over to where I stood, their arms coming to wrap around me in a desperate hug, freaked out by their response. I instantly backed away to inspect them. God, I'm so glad you're okay, Ariel exclaimed, her arms coming up to wrap around me once more. Me? I asked in confusion. Of course I'm okay. I slowly pulled away from her embrace. Why are you guys here? Where's Seth? I looked around the room, and within the same moment Seth came strolling in from a doorway, which I guessed led to the kitchen, because he had a small bowl in his hand and was munching away on its contents. His eyes found mine and they widened in relief, and he walked over to us. Hey, I didn't know you were coming over. He managed to mumble through a mouthful. I nodded my head, still frowning. Would someone please tell me what the heck is going on? I huffed. Elliot nodded and motioned towards the couches in the living room space. We walked over and each took a seat. Only Xavier and Seth remained standing beside the fireplace. Noah crossed his arms, not speaking a word, and when our eyes met and I silently demanded he'd say something, his only response was a shrug. I huffed and looked over at Elliot, who was rubbing his hands together in preparation to speak. Last night, we were faced with a bit of an inconvenience. What kind of inconvenience? Hours after you'd left with Xavier, a couple of men tried to break into the house. I gasped, my hand coming up to cover my mouth in shock. Ariel's leg was bouncing again. Noah and I were able to stall them while Seth took the girls to a hidden spot and contacted Xavier. His men showed up in no time and helped in taking down the intruders. My heart was beating loudly in my chest. Are you guys all right? Did anyone get hurt? I inspected them for any injuries, and my eyes fell on Elliot and Noah's bruised knuckles. My throat constricted imagining the fight they must have had to put up against those dangerously experienced men. We're all right. No one got hurt, Elliot reassured me. Well, except for those two bastards, Noah muttered under his breath. Who were they? Before realizing how dumb that question was, my eyes found Xavier's cool ones. They were sent by your rivals, weren't they? Xavier hesitated for a second, before nodding reluctantly. I thought you said they couldn't get to us here, I exclaimed in frustration. Xavier's eyes fell to the ground in what looked like shame, before they were suddenly clouded by rage. His jaws clenched tightly as he stood straighter. They weren't supposed to. So then how did they? And in Seth's house too. I gasped, my head snapping to Seth where he stood still munching on his cereal. What about your parents? When are they returning from their trip? They can't go back to their house. Those men could still have eyes set on the place. Seth shook his head. Don't worry. They won't be coming back anytime soon. I will be taking care of this. Xavier began to speak, and I was beginning to get frustrated with his promises, especially the ones he doesn't see through. I had to resist the urge to snap at him and remind him that he shouldn't keep making promises he will eventually break. But you all need to stay within the premises of this estate for now. You'll be safer here. Elliot nodded in agreement. We appreciate that. Xavier, thank you. My eyes widened at his words. Knowing Elliot, I would have expected him to be the first to attack Xavier with accusations about how he failed to keep his promise of keeping us safe here. Yet instead he was thanking him. I should head back to my affairs, Xavier announced before turning to Elliot, who was standing up to shake his hand like they were some business partners. I resisted the urge to roll my eyes. You have my contact details in case of any emergency, which I hope we won't have to deal with in the first place. Elliot nodded in response. Xavier then turned to me, his cool grey gaze falling on me as I remained seated. And I believe you would be in much better comfort with your friends. At least for a while, as I will be busy aiding to my own business. I nodded, understanding his implication that he will have to return to his family business protecting the entire state of Indiana against drug lords and whatnot. Xavier nodded in acknowledgement to the rest before heading out the front door, reaching out for Ariel's shaking hands that were tightly held together on her lap. I gripped tightly onto her quivering palms and rubbed soothing circles on the back of her wrists. Her soft eyes found mine, and they welled up with tears. So I pulled her forwards into an embrace. I'm so sorry I wasn't there with you, I whispered. She shook her head against my own, pulling away from my arms. No, I'm glad you weren't. Only more lives would have been in danger. She sniffed, trying to pull herself back together. Plus, this idiot over here. She inched her chin forward in the direction where Seth stood, whose eyes immediately snapped to us, was already having an emotional breakdown from having to watch over only Belly and I. He would have completely lost it if he had to watch out for one more life. I shook my head, suppressing a giggle as Seth's eyes narrowed dangerously into tight slits. I'm pretty sure had I been there, I would have been the one to protect him. Bella nodded from across the room, not containing her own laughter. Most likely you would have. Seth would have never been able to handle so much responsibility on his own. Hey now, Seth suddenly exclaimed while frowning. I saved your lives. You ungrateful brats. And these dudes knew I was capable of keeping you all safe. Otherwise they wouldn't have sent me off with you. He justified proudly. Noah rolled his eyes. The only reason I sent you off is because I knew you would have been a bigger pain in the ass beside us. Seth gasped dramatically, his eyes widening. Never mind them. Elliot finally spoke, walking over to him with a smile. You did a great job at keeping everyone safe by contacting Xavier instantly for backup. He gently patted Seth on the back, who was now slowly turning his head towards us with a proud smile. His eyes narrowed into an arrogant look. I laughed at his facial expression. Yeah, Ariel whispered reluctantly. She glanced at Seth, rolling her eyes. You did. Seth grinned widely, showing off his teeth. You owe me one. He winked at Ariel, but she just shook her head. So, what are we going to do today? Bella asked, getting up from her seat from across us. I think Noah and I'd better teach you guys some basic self-defense moves, Elliot suggested, but we all groaned in response, including Noah. We know how to fight back, Ariel replied in annoyance. Just because we're girls doesn't mean we're weak. Elliot frowned. I never claimed that you were. Just maybe a little uninformed. Ariel rolled her eyes, getting up from her seat and heading towards the kitchen. I'm making myself a sandwich. At the mention of food, my stomach gave a loud rumble. I jumped up from my seat. Make me one, I yelled before following behind her steps. Elliot stepped in front of me to block my path, his hand coming to wrap over my arm to stop me. And what about you? I gave him a smile. I haven't forgotten my lessons just yet. His blue eyes remained fixed on mine for a few seconds longer, taking in my response. Before he gave me a smile and nodded, he stepped back, allowing me to continue towards the kitchen. I don't mind learning some moves, I heard Bella say to him as I walked through the kitchen door. Ariel was already spreading some peanut butter on bread slices, and I went to reach out for the fridge door, pulling it open to find that it was already packed with food. Was anyone staying here before you guys came in? How's the fridge already packed up? I wondered out loud as I grabbed some orange juice and walked towards the cabinets in search of a glass. The place was practically abandoned by the time we showed up, Ariel informed me. But about an hour in, as we were settling in, a couple of people showed up with several grocery bags claiming a Mr. Kanuho had sent them over with food and some basic necessities that we could use. I couldn't stop the smile that formed on my face, overjoyed by Xavier's kindness towards my friend's comfort. But that smile didn't go unnoticed by Ariel, who studied me carefully and then raised a brow playfully. She hummed in interest. My eyes snapped to hers and I immediately bit the smile away, raising my glass of orange juice to my lips and taking a long chug. So, she walked over to me and handed me a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, which I instantly bit into. How did you spend last night? I glanced at her to gauge her expression and she gave me a playful wink. I rolled my eyes. We just talked. What did you talk about? She had an annoying, playful grin on her face as she clearly enjoyed teasing me, and I had to resist the urge to slap it off. I told him about Darius. Ariel suddenly choked on her food, dropping the last bit of her sandwich on the counter as she hunched over and began to cough violently. I patted her back roughly, and she reached out for my glass of orange juice, chugging it all at once. She stood back straight and inhaled sharply, regaining composure. You what? She exclaimed, but in a hushed tone, aware that our voices could echo to the living room where the rest were. I nodded, my eyes refusing to meet hers. He had his doubts about my past from all the arguments I had with Elliot. So he asked me, and after a lot of convincing, I decided I had to tell him if I wanted us to work out. Ariel went silent for a minute, pondering over what I'd just told her. And what did he say? She whispered, as if scared to know the answer. He asked for his name, which, to my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Noble, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. I didn't give. But why not? Ariel frowned, because there's no point in bringing it up. What could he possibly do? Find him, she exclaimed in a tone. Give that piece of shit a taste of his own medicine. Maybe put a bullet in his pea-sized brain. Xavier is a man of power, which we all have already concluded. He could find him in no time. I nodded my head as I put the remainder of my sandwich down, losing my appetite. I know he could, which is exactly why I didn't give him the name, because I don't want Xavier to have to deal with him. I spent a lot of effort to get to where I am today, to move past what that bastard did to me, and I wouldn't want my future to mix up with my past. Ariel eyed me for a few seconds, taking in my words, before reluctantly nodding in understanding. She stepped forward as her arm wrapped around my shoulder, pulling me in for a side hug. I'm glad you told him the truth. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Noble, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. Now when he looks at you, he'll also see the Wonder Woman that we all look up to. I chuckled. I prefer the Black Widow, whichever pleases you, but a bad bitch either way.